Hello, my name is Zachary Moore. Some of you may know me as the host of the Evolution 101 podcast, or as the moderator of the Apologia podcast. At any rate, I'm here today to take part in the Blasphemy Challenge, sponsored by the Rational Response Squad. In the third chapter of Mark, we find the following. The scribes who had come down from Jerusalem were saying, "Beelzebul is in him, and it is through the prince of devils that he drives devils out." So he called them to him and spoke to them in parables. How can Satan drive out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot last. And if a household is divided against itself, that household can never last. Now if Satan has rebelled against himself and is divided, he cannot last either. It is the end of him. But no one can make his way into a strong man's house and plunder his property unless he has first tied up the strong man. Only then can you plunder his house. In truth I tell you, all human sins will be forgiven, and all the blasphemies ever uttered, but anyone who blasphemes against the Holy Spirit will never be forgiven, but is guilty of an eternal sin. This was because they were saying, there is an unclean spirit in him. Now the blasphemy that Jesus is talking about here is actually the idea that he was able to perform his miracles by virtue of demon possession. The implication then of Jesus is that instead of being possessed by Satan, he was actually possessed by the Holy Spirit. So, to be most accurate, the blasphemy warned against here is actually that of equating Satan with the Holy Spirit, not necessarily of denying its existence. But, the latter would certainly count as blasphemy nonetheless, so I'm not going to split any hairs over it. Now, I have met lots of Christians who would argue that this idea of an unpardonable sin isn't actually part of Christian doctrine. They'll argue that salvation can't be lost by any individual act. Well, that can be argued, sure. But here it's really beside the point. I mean, the unbelievers who are taking part in this challenge really don't care about the subtleties of Christian doctrine anyway. There are much larger philosophical and theological problems which lead to apostasy or preclude acceptance. In a larger sense, this challenge serves as a chance for people who don't find the claims of religion persuasive to take a stand and make themselves heard. Let's face it, we still live in a world where the vast majority of people believe in some form of religion, whether it be Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, or what have you. It's only recently that those without religious affiliation or inclination have found it socially acceptable to broach their lack of belief in public. Thanks, in a large part, to the efforts of people like Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Dan Barker, and Brian Fleming and the Rational Response Squad, non-believers are starting to feel less and less like they have to hide in the closet anymore. And I think that's a good thing. And I think that's actually the most important part of this challenge, the discouragement of fear in matters of religion. It's easy to try to frighten someone into a particular belief system by threatening them either directly or indirectly with eternal torture. It's much harder to sit down amicably with someone and talk about your beliefs, both agreements and disagreements, with the hope that such a discussion will be beneficial to you both. And the first step towards that process is learning that you shouldn't be afraid to question anything, including your most deeply held beliefs. If any kind of dialogue is going to develop between religious believers and non-believers, there can't be any sacred cows. And so, whether Mark chapter 3 really does contain the unpardonable sin or not, I want to make the point that I'm not afraid to test it out. The Holy Spirit is really Satan. The Holy Spirit doesn't exist. Jesus didn't exist. God doesn't exist. See? If I'm not afraid to question anything, that means I have the freedom to question everything. And that freedom really is the sweetest fruit I've ever tasted. I Thanks for listening.